Departure of the PreChin Historical Studies in Chinese, and Sharpen of the Comprehensive Comparative Studies for Egyptian and Chinese. Econ wrote on the evening of Thursday, May 25, 2006. Self-translated on the afternoons of February 3 and 4, 2012. Econ notes, a preliminary study of comparative Egyptology. The study of Chinese PreChin history is a long-established topic, but its academic progress and research breakthroughs can view with small steps and slow stop. The Chinese PreChin history is a mess in current, and the studies of Chinese PreChin history is all on paper at present. I think the SIA culture should be determined at first, and then to say the Chinese PreChin history. So-called the Chinese PreChin history, the history before the Qin dynasty, or can be translated as PreChin history, refers to the history before the Qin, and so-called Chinese prehistory refers to the history before the Comhar 1 year of the Eastern Gru that recorded by the Glorious Kingdom dialogues. In the Chinese PreChin history, the most difficult to determine is the Chinese prehistory, that is the Chinese history before, and contain, the Western Gru dynasty. These eras were divided into dubious era, in the ancient, and myth, or legend, era by SIA Cohn's help and other scholars in the Republic of China. The reason why it is so named is because the history of this period is covered with layers of dark veils. We should classify and compare the relationship between Egyptian and PreChin Chinese in terms of language, paleography, costumes, historical relics, archaeological antiques, arts and crafts, etc. If they are homology, assuming they are homology, then all the results should be tally. I think our research must escape translation, misinformation, and false names, and go straight to the type of object itself. This is the archaeological typology advocated below. We can compare the image of Senior King, Worrell, in ancient Chinese paintings with Egyptian unearthed paintings. We can compare the costumes of Egyptian statues with the ancient and traditional costumes in main ethnics of China. You can compare the meaning between hieroglyphics of Egyptian kings' names with the oracle bone scripts of the Chinese king's name in the SIA period. I call the comparative research of Egypt and China with comprehensive comparative study of Egypt and China for transitory, belong to comparative history, comparative anthropology, and comparative archaeology. I personally think, these disciplines proposed by Western scholars need to be uniformly named comparative studies on comprehensive humanities. The comparison of relations between Egypt and China was originally proposed by French scholars during the Napoleonic era, but they have not completed, maybe due to the limitation of knowledge structures. However, there has been an academic spree emphasizes both Egyptology and Sinology in Europe. When I was young ago, I also doubted and disdained the relationship between Egyptian and Chinese. The main reason was that my mind is bound by traditional education, so I have not dare and need to think. And later, I learned that Western scholars have proposed by numbers of studies, there are close relationship during the scripts of Babylon, Akkad, ancient Greece, and ancient Egypt, as well as the relationship of them with the Chinese scripts. In 1667, the German Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, 1602–1680, published his book The China Illustrata, and believed that the descendants of Shem in the Bible led the Egyptians come to China and taught the ancient Egyptian scripts. The Chinese did not learn the all, and added some creations by themselves, so the result became another script system as the Chinese scripts. In 1716, the French scholar Petrus de Hute, 1630–1721, published the book History of the Commerce and Navigation in Ancient, Histoire du Commerce et de la Navigation des Anciens, and believed the Egyptian civilization was introduced to China through India. In November 1758, the French sinologist Joseph de Gignes gave a speech, lecture, entitled The Chinese are an Egyptian colony, Les Chinois sont une colonie égyptienne. He compared the Chinese pictographs with the ancient Egyptian scripts, and proposed that the Chinese civilization as same the Greek civilization, was inspired by the ancient Egyptians, and the strokes of Chinese scripts contain the letters. For example, he believes that the father of Chinese scripts is composed of I and D, and need be pronounced Jad or Jod. It is consistent with Jod, father, in Coptic, that preserves the ancient Egyptian components. Then the ancient Egyptian scripts have not been interpreted yet. In 1822, the French scholar François Champollion found the key of the interpretation on ancient Egyptian scripts. At the end of 1898 usually, the oracle bone scripts of Shang dynasty were discovered in China. The Japanese Shishisaburo Itazu published a book The United Origin of the Scripts of Chinese and Egyptian, De Unitate Originis Literarum Sinicarum et Egyptiacarum, in 1933, and published the revisions and editions of it in 2 years later. Besides, also proposed the dragon horse and talent turtle, which loaded the literatures in the Chinese legend of Map Extra Hoer, Book Extra Lauer, were all ships and the evidence of Egyptian civilization landing by the Yellow River. After that, based on my long-term study and comprehend of Chinese culture, I didn't completely agree with the view of the Chinese civilization is based on Egyptian culture, which believed by Western scholars, so I hardened my mind and began to work on the comparative study of Chinese and Egyptian cultures. Not long ago, I sorted the records of SIA's kings and researched kings of Old Egyptian. And I recently discovered some clues such as the origin of grave SE, Berry West, and the origin of undead drug of Western Queen, Mother, and the origin of Western Paradise. Why are there almost all have the scenes of ferry run by boat were depicted in Egyptian murals with burial customs of Pharaoh's death? Have you ever thought about the destination of the ferry run by boat is Egypt of Africa on the Atlantic coast, so where is the start point of the sailboat? Why the undead drug of Western Queen, Mother, in Chinese legends can make people immortal, and the ancients are really twang so not to know the scientific story that can't resurrect from death, and stubbornly misthink there is a immortal magic in the far west from China. And according to my research, the Western Queen, Mother, is precisely the sovereign of Egypt and Africa, now note, arrow. And there have indeed shown the mummies of bodies can be immortal for thousands of years, by archaeology discovered in the Egyptian pyramids. And is this the desirable immortality by unfinished bodies, flesh, and is the undead drug of legend by aseptic technique of mummy? Why is there a Western paradise and Western polar state under the heaven, Eurasia, which believed both by Indian Buddhism and Chinese Taoism, Stoic? Is it the stupid or lies of the ancients, and could deceive the world for thousands of years? Why is it said that a virtuous person after death, will be surpassed in the Western Paradise. Can this explain that almost all have the scenes of ferry run by boat were depicted in Egyptian murals with burial customs of Pharaoh's death? Egypt and China have common origin, but they are thousands of miles apart. How to achieve connection by long span in the early ancient times? Can this be explained else? The pyramids of Egypt are the tombs of Sia's kings, and the actual rule of Sia's kings may not be in the Africa? Can this be explained yet? The ancient people who held certain assets could travel from East Asia to Africa, and complete, their lives, by their pious beliefs and political unity in the PreChin era? Thanks. Contact Econ, GENEOLOGY @hotmail.com.